In the words of the inimitable John Cleese, now for something completely different. The field of modern acoustics encompasses an incredibly wide variety of applications in both the hard sciences and the arts. And considering this vast reach of the discipline, it might come as a surprise to you to learn that the origins of the discipline can be traced back to one original question. Why do we find certain intervals to be more appealing than others? Over the millennia, philosophers, musicians, and scientists have offered dozens of explanations, but there still is no generally accepted definitive theory. And over the decades that I have been pondering this enigma, many times I have had people say to me, consonance is cultural, or consonance depends on context. The clearest and most forceful expression of this opinion I have encountered is that of Ernst Toch. As he put it, it may be concluded beyond any discussion that no sound considered by itself and detached from any context can, under any circumstances, be other than neutral and meaningless. And that's already a pretty strong statement, but he wasn't finished yet. He went on to say, the future will look back at this doctrine of consonances and dissonance with the same pitying smile which we bestow upon the once upon a time belief in witches and evil demons living inside certain individuals. So according to Toch, merely asking the question puts us on the same level as primitive superstitious cretins. Yet the widespread preference for these intervals, or at least some of them, across widely divergent cultures and musical styles seriously undermines Toch's conviction, dare I say, hubris. So today I'm going to ask you to think about musical intervals in ways which you probably have never done before, from outside of a modern, weird musical mindset. And to help you get out of that conceptual box, I'd like to begin by talking about something other than music. Please bear with me, I'll get back to the topic soon enough. Since I first saw his monumental film, 2001: A Space Odyssey, I've been a huge fan of Stanley Kubrick's work. In 1968, I was only 14 years old, and I, like so many others, I was utterly dumbstruck by the amazing images he had created. So when his next film appeared, I rushed to see it. There I sat in the dark movie theater, consumed with curiosity as to how the film would begin. What imagery would he give us with this time? In more ways than one, I was not prepared for what I was about to see. And I have to say that here in this environment, the effect is nothing like in reality. Imagine a totally dark theater with a screen as large as this entire wall. It helps maybe if you do this and just concentrate on the screen, but try to focus on the screen and nothing else. This is what happened. First, I thought the projectionist had made some kind of a mistake. Perhaps he left some kind of a test reel on the projector. But when the first minimal credits appeared, I realized this was actually the movie itself. What on earth was Kubrick doing by giving us nothing to look at except a full screen of two primary colors for 3/4 of a minute? Now, if you go to YouTube, there are dozens and dozens of videos describing the use of color in filmmaking, and they all more or less give this same advice.
And to use color in your films is very simple. Just establish the color scheme at the beginning of the film and carry that throughout the entire project. If you choose blue as a bad color, then have your villain wear some sort of blue, or maybe when something bad happens, there's a blue light in the background. Establish the color at the beginning of the film, and then you are able to subconsciously make the audience feel a certain way without saying anything and without the audience even knowing about it.
So did you notice what he said? If you choose blue as a bad color, then you associate it with in the opening scenes with bad things. In other words, context creates the meaning of the color. Color becomes a sort of Wagnerian leitmotif, except with an alternative spelling of light. But in A Clockwork Orange, there is no context yet to define the colors. Kubrick was actually using them for their own innate effects. A number of studies have shown that there are links between emotional connotations and colors which are universal. Associations which cut across a broad swath of cultures and languages. So what are the emotive associations of red and blue? Red is associated with danger, anger, violence, passion, sexuality, and excitement. Blue implies trust, dependability, orderliness, spirituality, and calm. Viewing these colors also produces significant physiological effects. Red increases respiration, heart rate, blood pressure, and appetite, as well as reducing your ability to think clearly and rationally. Viewing blue has exactly the opposite effects, reducing the various body functions and improving your ability to concentrate. So if these effects are not cultural, where do they come from? To understand that, we have to go to the field of evolutionary psychology. Basically, it holds that human psyche has been shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, favoring those behaviors which gave us survival advantages. And even though the original shaping forces have mostly disappeared from our modern environment, this human firmware is still present within us and continues to have profound influences upon our behavior today. So how did our ancestral environments create these color associations? In other words, what were the specific stimuli with the colors red and blue during hundreds and thousands, if not millions of years? Three things red immediately come to mind: blood, fire, and genitalia. Blue depends a bit more on where you are, but there's one thing we all see: the sky. You might also see water and ice. So what Kubrick was doing by forcing us to stare at pure intense colors for so long was to engage us at a deep, primeval psychological level, tapping into associations buried well below the conscious mind. He is subliminally priming the viewer with the central theme of the film, the opposing forces of bestiality and the sublime. But how is it that other filmmakers can use colors in a completely discretionary way? That's because we've become used to color as a decoration, an ornament. We give things whatever colors we want. A mere walk down a supermarket aisle is a veritable orgy of brilliant colors, all screaming at our eyes. And we've become insensitive to the deeper emotive power of color through overstimulation. Our ancestors, on the other hand, did not color their world. Their world had color. Could there be something similar going on with musical intervals? Now, the most basic form of evolutionary programming is called an adaptive trait, with which the survival advantage of the resultant behavior is immediately obvious. We have a large number of such adaptive traits, and two or more adaptive traits can come together to create a new whole which is greater than the sum of the parts. This is called an emergent trait. Emergent traits also have adaptive advantages, but they may not be immediately obvious. There's a fourth type of behavior which borrows its name from architecture, a spandrel, which is an element of no real structural importance. It just fills in a space between other vital elements. Take a spandrel out of the structure and nothing happens. So what is music? It's obvious that it has no immediate survival advantage. So is it an emergent trait or merely a spandrel? The cognitive psychologist Steven Pinker caused quite a stir several decades back when he declared that music was superfluous in an evolutionary sense. Music could vanish from our species, he said, and the rest of our life would be virtually unchanged. True or not, one thing is certain. Music does a very good job at tickling our senses. This book, which just came out this January, provides an excellent overview of the latest research in the neuroscience of music. In the second half, Satori focuses on how listening to music triggers the reward systems deep within our brains. At the heart of this examination is what he calls the chills. Those moments when music moves us so much that strong physical sensations wash over our bodies. Satori refers to these strong embodied reactions to magical musical moments as hedonic responses. And I would like to introduce a further concept, which I call intervallic hedonic response. Many years ago, when I first began tuning harpsichords, I noticed that hearing a pure major third gave me a wash of physical pleasure. And later, when I began building musical instruments, I discovered that it was incredibly pleasurable to sing fifths and pure thirds against the loud droning of the machinery in the workshop. Over the years, I've encountered a number of musicians and singers who tell me, often spontaneously, that they too get the chills from singing pure harmonies. Now, lest you think this is just a Western musical phenomenon, I'd like to give you a couple of examples to the contrary.
Anyewa baba, anyewa koko, ye ye ye, hallelujah.
And even more compelling, this snippet from Martin Craddock's wonderful documentary on the tribes of the Congo.
The Baka are one of many indigenous groups living in the tropical rainforests of the Congo Basin. Scattered across the forests from the Atlantic coast of Gabon and Cameroon to the mountains of Uganda and Burundi, they were called pygmies by Victorian explorers due to their small size. Others include their neighbours, the Aka, the Bongo and the Gweli, as well as the Mbuti, Efe and Twa from the eastern Congo Basin. In spite of their wide distribution, they share certain core values: egalitarianism, reliance on the forest for food, medicine, shelter and spiritual well-being, and an extraordinary aptitude for music. The polyphonic singing, such as this 1958 recording by Colin Turnbull of the Ituri forest people singing an elephant hunting song, is heard amongst all the groups across the forest.
So how can we begin to investigate the possibility of the existence of intervallic hedonic response? Modern research on the subject is almost universally flawed by one or more fundamental errors. But by far, the most damning error is that these studies are always passive. They are based on listening to musical examples. And whatever was going on in our ancestral environment, we can be certain of one thing: it wasn't this. Nor was it this. It's self-evident that when humans first began to make music, they did so by opening their mouths and singing. Is there any way that singing a fifth or a third might have triggered our deep internal reward system more than any other random interval? This is a graphic I designed to show the interactions between the harmonic spectra of two tones. On the left, we see the positions of harmonics which are congruent, which I call internal unisons. On the right, we see the interaction between closely spaced non-congruent harmonics, which Helmholtz called roughness. He postulated that the less roughness an interval has, the more consonant it is. The octave is, of course, the most congruent of all possible intervals, with very little roughness. The fifth is less congruent and has a little more roughness. The major third, even more so. This decrease in congruence and increase in roughness continues as we move through the consonances in the traditional ordering. So there's at least correlation between the acoustic reality and Helmholtz's theory. But is that causation? I would like to suggest that there is another way of looking at this balance, not as opposites, but as two different components of perception. In communication theory, for any type of transmission, be it audio or visual, we speak of the ratio between signal and noise. Ideally, we want only signal with no noise at all. But nothing is perfect, and thus there is always some amount of noise. There are many possible combinations: strong signal with medium noise, weak signal with little noise, and the worst possibility, lots of noise and very little signal. But the important thing to realize is that they are not opposites. They are just two different components of the same transmission. I would like to propose that the traditional ordering of consonants can be viewed in the same way. The more internal unisons, the stronger the signal. And the more roughness, the more noise. But why is signal important to us in an evolutionary sense? Evolutionary psychologists generally agree that the most important of our many cognitive capabilities is that which we call shared intentionality, which is the ability and motivation to engage with others in collaborative, cooperative activities with joint goals and intentions. All human cultures engage in some kind of ritual behavior which strengthens this idea of we're all doing the same thing together, usually in the form of dance and music. Every group has their own special dance and song, and if you can do it, and do it well, then you are part of the tribe. And as anyone who has ever taken part in such ceremonies knows, once you really get it, it is tremendously rewarding at a deep, dare I say, hedonic level. Could the consonant intervals be an even deeper and more subtle version of doing the same thing together? In this model, the signal we are listening for is that aspect of the sound which tells us we are doing the same thing together, the internal unisons. It's obvious that this explains why men and women sing in octaves the world over, but it doesn't explain the clear preference for the other two intervals, the fifth and the major third. This may come from the different vocal ranges of men, women, and children, both in speaking and singing. Men have the lowest voices, women are generally an octave higher, and children even higher yet. These differences have to do with the morphology of the vocal cavity and the vocal cord length, and have nothing to do with culture. But regardless of who we are, everyone begins life the same way, as children. We spend the first 10 years of our lives, more or less, with no choice but to sing an octave or more higher than the low voices of men. That is, our formative experience with consonant intervals is most likely not in close spacing. This changes the signal-to-noise ratio drastically and greatly enhances our awareness of doing the same thing together. Take the fifth and the 12th. In terms of internal unisons, there is no difference, but there is a marked reduction in noise. The same thing happens with the major third when opened up to a major 10th. Signal remains constant, but the noise drops dramatically. If we go an octave higher yet again, which is quite within the realm of possibility, the noise has been reduced to almost nothing. This intensification of the ability to perceive sameness does not happen with any of the other traditional consonances. In fact, with the fourth, the minor third, and the 2/6, the opposite happens. They lose signal while retaining noise. So in closing, I would like to offer some general guidelines for possible future studies along these lines. Focus on music making, preferably singing. Use pure intervals only, no equal temperament. Seek subjects who report hedonic responses. Investigate reward system stimulus and pathways triggered by IHR. And investigate intervals in both close and open spacing. And in closing, I want to leave you with one more snippet of the wonderful documentary by Martin Craddock, Over the Music of the Baka.
In a rainforest, survival is dependent on your listening skills. Hearing becomes your primary sense. When walking through the forest, all members of a group will instantly react to sound, freezing mid-step. The Baka see the forest as their loving parent who will look after you and keep you safe. You perceive all sounds as the forest speaking to you, telling you what you need to know. All sounds in the forest are telling you something. The hum of bees leads you to honey. The song of frogs leads you to water. There's no need to filter out irrelevant sounds. There aren't any. In our busy modern lives, we learn to cut out the myriad of useless noises that clutter our life. We actively learn not to listen.
Thanks. Any questions? I know we're running short on time, but. Yes, absolutely.
Right, thank you very much. That's a really cool approach to that. I like it. I just wonder, I heard someone say or read somewhere, I'm not sure if it's true, that people are born with what we call absolute hearing, that we hear specific pitches, right? You hear something, you know it's an F sharp, for example, and we lose that ability because we learn that there's such a thing as, so we discover that it's irrelevant and we can drop that ability. I have no idea if it's true, but do you know, and if it is, what relevance does it have to your approach?
Well, I've read a lot of literature primarily about the perception of tone, intervals, things like that, and it has touched upon what we call perfect pitch before. And from memory, I would say that it's not a universal, that there's a small percentage, I can't remember exactly what the percentage was, but there's a small percentage of people that are born with it. Yeah, I don't know if it really has any bearing upon that. You're still, basically what we're talking about is, and the whole problem of equal temperament too is a huge thing. I mean, I had to cut about 15 minutes out of my talk just talking about the evils of equal temperament and how it destroys our ability to hear in a more primitive way. So if you're going to talk about perfect pitch, and also another huge section I had to cut out was talking about how most cultures around the world do not use a 12-tone system, a chromatic system. they use a 5 or an 8, or moving into Indian classical music 23, or Arabic music 75 note octave division. So yeah, what would you say about Arab children? Are they born with 75 note perfect pitch? Are Indian children born with 23 note perfect pitch? So it's an interesting comment, but I don't think it has a whole lot of bearing on the basic issue.
Okay, so one, it's not true that
Yeah.
people are born with this and they lose it evolutionarily,
Uh,
and B, it's not relevant. Okay, thank you.
any other questions?
Thanks a lot for this fascinating talk and for the examples and for the theory. I was just wondering, I'm sure you've thought about this, but please let us know what would be the consequences of this theory of yours, of this model of yours on cultural listening to music, because in our case we don't walk through the rainforest for better or worse. So I suppose we would better shut out our ears walking down the Meridiana, etc. But we do listen to some very sophisticated things. And I wonder if, I mean, I'm sure you've thought about that, how it applies to art music listening.
Probably doesn't. No, and I'm not so interested in that, I have to say. What intrigues me more is, why do we see this all over the world? And also, my own personal experience, why do I have these feelings? I mean, for me, a pure major third it's like getting into a warm bathtub on a cold winter's day. And I had a lot of other examples which I had to cut out of other styles where people are singing pure tuning, and they're obviously having tremendous fun. And like I say, I've spoken to a lot of people who, the Gundecha brothers, for example, I've spoken to them, and they say the same thing. When they hit a pure third or a pure fifth, it's a physical sensation. It's not just, I know it's right, it's properly tuned. It's a sensation. In Western art music and equal temperament, that is not there. It's just not there. So just like we learn to not hear buses and cars when we're walking down the street here, we learn not to listen that way. We actively learn not to listen that way. You can relearn to listen that way, and my experience in teaching people to tune keyboard instruments over many, many years is that some people hear it already. They come to me and they say, oh yeah, I hear that. Others, you work with them for a while and they go, oh yeah. And others, you can work with them for 6 or 7 months and they never get it. So I suspect it may be, to a certain extent, an innate capability that not everybody has, like perfect pitch. Which doesn't mean that it's not a human universal. Human universal applies in 2 different ways. There's individual universals, like we all have the universal capacity to language, and there are group universals. And in group universals, we don't need everybody in the group to be able to do that. We only need a fairly large number of people in groups everywhere around the planet doing that, to call it a group universal. I had one more thought I wanted to say about that. Question is, how many people with any given tribal group does it take to establish a practice? Do we need everybody capable of doing the same thing? Or 10%, 20%? I mean, we think of primitive tribes as being egalitarian, huh? All the men go off hunting and all the women take care of the kids and process the food and maybe gather nuts and things like that. But it doesn't mean that all the men are equally good at hunting. You talk to them and their specialization, you know. Oh, you want to hunt rabbit? Go with him. He's a good rabbit hunter. You want to hunt deer? Oh, they're really good at hunting deer. And I remember one book that I was reading about primitive tribes, and they were talking about the shaman that they had, the magic man, the man who communicated with the spirits. And he was doing some ceremony, and the European guy who had been living with him for quite a while, he said, boy, he's really good, isn't he? one of the natives says, yeah, we're really lucky to have him. He's fantastic. And the European guy said, wouldn't you like more like him? He said, oh, no, that'd be too much. We'd never get anything done. So, yeah, I don't think it really, maybe you could say it's a good argument against atonal music. Good argument for why 12-tone serialism never really was very popular, except for academically, intellectually. Nobody walks down the street whistling serial melodies. Huh? So.
Highly stimulating conversation, but I am afraid that we are very late. So.
Yes. Okay. Just a quick question. Do you think there's relationship between the interaction of the harmonics and body resonations, like in cavities or something that could give this tactile pleasure or connect with this pleasure that you were talking about, or is there?
It's always a possibility. I mean, this is an area which has not been investigated, primarily because, like I say, modern people have a modern way of thinking about things. They use modern stimulus, equal temperament, which destroys the whole edifice. And well, there's a lot of research about how the reward system is stimulated by musical events, by how music moves and changes and progresses. Nobody has done any research about that same reward system in relationship to just pure sounds. So it's an open field.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Thank you all. So we have a little 15 minutes interval. Well, they will perhaps are already ready for going on, but we had quarter of an hour.
We'll take 10 minutes for them to get ready.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you, and see you in 10 minutes.